Hi, this is Brock Dickinson, and I'm coming to you today from the Millbrook Mi'kmaq community in Spikanaktik, deep in Wahapanaki territory in the region known as Mi'kma'ki. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about the concept of economic reconciliation. So we know in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, that one of the key issues we have to deal with is reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And that includes the concept of economic reconciliation, that having stripped away so many of the lands, territories, assets, resources of Indigenous peoples over the course of the last 200 or 300 years, that there is a need to find new economic solutions to bring these people back into the traditional rights and access points that they had to the economy, and to ensure that we are engaging with those communities moving forward in responsible ways. And I think this is difficult in the economic development context for many communities. Years ago, I was doing some work in relation to the development of the Attawapiskat diamond mines in Northern Ontario. These are diamond mines that were on Indigenous territories and controlled by Indigenous communities to a large extent. And so there were a series of companies circling around that community trying to sort of get the rights to process the diamonds that were coming out of those mines. And part of the selection process of where the diamond processing facilities would go was related to the level of cooperation that existed between municipal economic development interests and the economic development interests of the First Nations. And I can remember working with Tiffany, a company out of New York, to look at the possibility of winning this contract to be the ones that were polishing and processing these diamonds. And as we considered different communities, one of the criteria for site selection was that there needed to be a strong established relationship between the municipality they were going to go to and the First Nations in that region. And we took them to a particular community, one that I won't name, but one that claimed to have had a strong relationship with the local First Nation. And so we added them to the list of communities to visit. And as Tiffany and other interests sort of entered into the first meeting in this community with all of the key players gathered around the table, the mayor of the municipality walked up to the chief of the First Nation and said, "Hey, nice to meet you," which was a clear indication that they hadn't been working together previously. And so sometimes one of the things that we struggle with in economic reconciliation is this notion that it's not something that happens on the spur of the moment. It's something that happens because we plan ahead for it, because we create relationships that allow us to have long-term connections, communications avenues, and understandings with First Nations communities if we hope to work together on economic development issues. Sometimes we run into this challenge because the way that the economy is structured in the Western world is based on the philosophies of people like Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith was the guy who wrote The Wealth of Nations back at the start of the Industrial Revolution to explain how this newly emerging capitalist economy was going to work. And the economy that he envisioned was one that was based on transaction. And so Smith in The Wealth of Nations talks about the idea of a baker, for example. And he says, a baker bakes bread, he wants to sell you bread. If he acts like a jerk, you're never going to buy his bread. So the whole point of becoming a baker is that you treat people nicely so they'll buy your bread. There's a transactional filter that goes into the way two people relate to or connect to each other. If I'm extra nice, you might buy more bread. If I get to know your preferences and your interests and your dietary habits, I can make specialized bread and sell you even more of it. But it's all based on this notion that relationship is a filter through which transaction occurs. If I'm a jerk and I don't put effort into relationships, I don't get transactions, and so I suffer financially and economically because I'm not playing that game. But if I do make that effort to build a relationship, the goal of it or the point of it is to encourage transaction. And so Western economics, the kind of economics that we often think about in economic development, is very transactional. How do I expand that operation? How do I land that new plant in my community? How do I grow that local business? I'm always looking for the transaction. And in many ways, that's the opposite of what we need to be contemplating and considering when it comes to the notion of economic reconciliation. Because in part, when we think about reconciliation, it comes in the context of truth. And truth is based in large part on trust. Trust is not transactional. Trust is something that is built between people over time and that takes genuine effort in order to achieve. And this is something that's kind of central to the notion of economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities. So here I am in Mi'kma'ki, and there's a particular concept that kind of speaks to this particular way of seeing the world in Indigenous communities of this region. And this is the notion of Natumkalimk. Natumkalimk says relationships between people cannot be transactional, that we all sit inside a web of relationships in which every person is connected to every other person, and in fact we are connected to the natural world around us as well. And so the ideal way for those relationships to work is based on the notion of reciprocity and not on transaction. So Natumkalimk replaces the idea of being nice with this notion that we need to be genuinely engaged with and responsive to each other. And in fact, it's often based on this notion of 4 key principles, sometimes called the 4 R's. And those are respect, responsibility, relationship, and reciprocity. And reciprocity is the key. Reciprocity is the opposite of transaction. It says that we have to find ways to engage with Indigenous communities that allow us to build fair and shared systems rather than transactional systems. And the only way to do that is to invest time, to invest energy, to invest resources, and to build a relationship long in advance so that we're not showing up to a meeting and saying, hey, nice to meet you. It's something that has to exist in the long run and not in the short run. And although I'm in Mi'kma'ki and we're talking about Mi'kmaq concepts like Natumkalimk, this is not a principle or a set of ideas that is strange to other Indigenous communities around Turtle Island. We have to think about the 7 grandfathers principles when we're talking to Anishinaabe peoples. We have to think about the Great Law of Peace when we're talking to the Haudenosaunee. There's a sense that if we truly wish to establish the playing field or the grounds for economic reconciliation, we need to do it in the context of the communities we're seeking to engage with, on their terms and building their kind of reciprocity, rather than imagining that we can just do transactions and sell some people a loaf of bread. So hopefully that gives you some insights on how to make some steps forward on the reconciliation front, but it also points to the hard work that needs to be done to make any progress in this space.